Good evening and welcome to this evening's lecture. Is the microphone working all right? I don't see any hands, so we'll go ahead. Here, I think it was about 12 or 14 years ago, Ken, after you returned from India, from serving as U.S. ambassador there. Since then, our lecture been trying to get Dr. Galbraith back to give us a return lecture, but without success until this evening. On this particular trip to Iowa, and Dr. Galbraith claims that he has to come back to Iowa occasionally to kind of get his intellectual batteries recharged, and this is one of those occasions. This week, Dr. Galbraith has been lecturing at both Iowa City and Ames, as SUI and Iowa State were able to schedule his lectures on 2 successive nights. Possibly this scheduling cooperation between ISU and SUI might be suggestive and even useful to other entities at Iowa's 2 universities who are striving to schedule football games and concerts of various kinds. Dr. Galbraith was born in Ontario, Canada, but has lived in the United States since receiving his baccalaureate degree from the University of Toronto in 1931. He received his PhD at the University of California. He has concentrated his talents and his energies over the years that he's been in this country, since 1931, in 3 important arenas of activity and, I should add, action. Within the first arena of service, Dr. Galbraith is an outstanding teacher, serving on the university staffs at California, Princeton, and Harvard. He has been awarded honorary degrees by the universities of California, Michigan, Massachusetts, and Brandeis in the United States, Toronto in Canada, Mysore in India, Cambridge and Durham in England, Louvain in Belgium, and the University of Paris. Within the second arena of his activity, Dr. Galbraith has served the United States government with distinction as ambassador to India, as administrator of the Office of Price Administration, sometimes called the OPA, which there aren't many in this room that may remember by those initials. It was during World War II, and as director of the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey. He was awarded the coveted Medal of Freedom by President Truman. President Kennedy once described Dr. Galbraith as, in quote, my best ambassador. Prime Minister Nehru of India described Dr. Galbraith as a very able and brilliant man that served in his country. Now, within the third arena of services, Dr. Galbraith is a prolific author, sometimes controversial, but always innovative, communicative, and talented, with over 20 major books published to his credit. His best-known works, now this is a subjective judgment, of course, at least to me, his best-known works, which have been read very widely in the United States and foreign countries, include American Capitalism, The Affluent Society, The New Industrial State, and A China Passage. During the past 3 years, Dr. Galbraith has developed a 13-part television series for the BBC entitled The Age of Uncertainty, which is being televised by British television starting, I believe it's May 19th, is it? May 19th. It is also to be broadcast over U.S. Public Broadcasting System, PBS, and also will be broadcast over the CBC in Canada. This year, his latest book, entitled The Age of Uncertainty, is being published, which expands and amplifies the ideas contained in the TV series. Dr. Galbraith told some of our students this afternoon at a seminar that he felt that this series was ample justification for college students to watch television. In between his other activities, Dr. Galbraith served 2 years as editor of Fortune magazine and as president of the American Economic Association. He is a fellow in the National Institute of Arts and Letters and a member of many distinguished professional and service societies. Dr. Galbraith and his wife live in Cambridge, Massachusetts, with part-time residences in Vermont and Switzerland, particularly where he's done much of his writing. He is described by a friend, I presume it's a friend, at least up until now, as an avid and competent skier, and ranks close to former President Ford in this sport. I take great pleasure in presenting to you John Kenneth Galbraith, the Paul M. Warburg Distinguished Professor of Economics Emeritus at Harvard University, who will speak to us on the topic, the Industrial Society, What is the Valid View? Dr. Galbraith, all yours.
Thank you very much, John. It's worth, I must say, coming out to Iowa, not only to bring peace to these two great educational institutions, which I gather to be comparable to rapprochement between Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland, but also to hear the marvelous way one can be introduced. I hate to supplement my introduction, but I would like to remind everybody here that my degree from the University of California was in agricultural economics, and I would like further to remind everybody that in case there's any notion as to what the priority of subjects here is at Iowa State University, which I believe Jerry Ford referred to as Ohio State University at one time, that I'm going back to my old university day after tomorrow, which is celebrating its 150th anniversary, University of Toronto. When I went there, it was an extremely aristocratic and structured place. The people who studied Greek and Latin had by far the most prestige. After that, maybe English literature. In the professional schools, law and medicine took a very lofty attitude toward all of the other professions. And I'm going back after 50 years, just 50 years since I showed up there, in reflection of the new priorities that obtain at the University of Toronto, and I'm sure here at Iowa State and elsewhere in the civilized world, because I graduated in animal husbandry, and my return for the 150th anniversary recognizes the final emergence of animal husbandry as the queen of the sciences. I gather from the applause that there are only two members of the university. There are only two people at Ohio. I gather from the applause that there are only two people here and two people at Ohio State still studying that subject. In my lecture this evening, I want to outline to you what I believe to be the valid image of the modern industrial society, that of the advanced non-socialist society, the United States, Germany, Japan, as distinct from the Soviet Union or the Eastern European countries or China or the Third World. I've long felt, as some of you know, that there are elements of convergence, not to the market system, but to the use of the very large enterprise in both the Soviet Union and in the Western industrial countries, that where you have a very large task to perform, you have the same, broadly speaking, organization to do it, and that this stamps its character on the culture. That if you're going to make steel on a large scale, you're going to have about the same organization in Gary, Indiana as in Magnitogorsk or vice versa, and that organization is going to have an important influence in shaping the character of the communities where one finds it. But I'm going to leave this rather engaging line of thought aside and consider the issue of the structure of what we still call the capitalist countries, and then go on to test this view for the as it applies to the great modern tasks of managing inflation, unemployment, and inequality, unequal development, and for assessing the role of government. To get the image of industrial society clearly in mind, one must at the outset, I think, be sharply aware of two factors which act specifically to distort our view of economic society and which both have a damaging effect on economic instruction. Although I hasten to say, Professor Timmons, that I happily exempt Iowa State from any criticism as regards its teaching. I've always had a very close association with the economists and agricultural economists of this institution, and I know that they would never be guilty of any of the errors which I'm going to assign economists generally this evening. The first of these distorting factors is the very great desire of economists to think of the ultimate subject matter with which they deal in static terms. Physics, chemistry, geology, all deal with a non-changing subject matter. What is known and taught about these subjects changes only as information is added or as interpretation is revised. And these, we all agree, are sciences. And it's the great desire of a great many economists to see their subject as a science too. Accordingly, and without much thought, they hold that its ultimate subject matter is also fixed. Business firm, the market, the consumer, like the oxygen molecule or the geologist's granite, are for all time. Economists search quite avidly for new information, but that information is then associated, is then draped on a relatively fixed view of what is the ultimate character of economic matter, a relatively fixed view of the business enterprise, of labor relations, of the market, of the consumer, or of the economic role of government. I'm not here making an abstruse or theoretical point. The first step toward a more valid perception of the economic problem is an appreciation of the very high rate of change that has been occurring in basic economic institutions. The large business corporation is the greatest of these instruments of change. And in consequence of the movement that it initiates, there is a very rapid change in the nature of trade union organization and in the mood of collective bargaining, and also in the class structure of modern economic society. And among other things, the increasing refusal of people to agree that because of occupation or race, they should be poor, they should have, as a prescriptive characteristic of their occupation or race, a lower standard of consumption. And there's also been a rapid change in the services and responses of the modern state. And the effect of these changes, very simply, is to make the economic knowledge that is valid in one generation largely, not completely, but largely obsolete in the next generation. And it makes also obsolete the prescription and policy that is based on unchanged knowledge. The second factor which distorts economic understanding is the very great social and political and professional convenience of a wrong image of economic society. I think I can best illustrate this abstraction, as it too must seem, by proceeding to the structure of the modern industrial economy. The presently accepted image of the structure of the industrial economy, the textbook image, as I can perhaps call it, is of numerous business firms distributed in each industry, all these firms subordinate to their market, to prices that they do not individually control, and thus subordinate ultimately to the instruction of the consumer. Being relatively numerous in their industry, the firms are competitive. Any tendency to overprice products is corrected by the undercutting of a competitor. These firms are also, as economists say, entrepreneurial, which is to say that they have a very simple command structure. Authority within the firm lies with the boss, on whom overwhelmingly achievement depends. The entrepreneur or boss being the owner, the partial owner, the direct instrument of the owners, the motivation is also very simple and very straightforward. It is to maximize the return to his effort, to his initiative, and to his property, to make as much money as possible. To say that the firm is subordinate to the market, and here I repeat, is to say that it submits to prices that it does not control. It is to say that decision originates with the consumer, and this decision, expressed through the market, is sovereign. And if the consumer has sovereign power, the firm cannot have appreciable power. Those of you who have accomplished a really advanced course in formal logic will, I think, agree with me that you can't have two possessors of sovereign power. The business firm, like any other citizen, is also without organic power in the state. It can vote, petition the Congress or the executive, and it can try to persuade. But it cannot dictate, dominate, or compete in power with the government. There is one exception, where the firm has influence over prices and output, and that is the case of monopoly or oligopoly. But monopoly, or the control of prices and production in an industry by one firm, and oligopoly, control by a few firms, is never the rule in this image. These are always the exception. They are called imperfections in the system, and we use the word imperfection to affirm that monopoly and oligopoly are exceptions to the general situation. The image of economic society which I've just sketched, which I venture to think some of you will find not wholly unfamiliar from your diligent reading of McConnell, is, I know that it's McConnell because I autographed a copy of it this afternoon by some rather advanced student who was under the impression that that was my name. I didn't debate, I just signed my name. The image of economic society which I've just sketched is admirable proof also of the resistance of economics to change. In the last 90 years, the notion of oligopoly has been added to that of monopoly in microeconomics. There is now, in basic microeconomic instruction, usually some bow to the modern great corporation and some reference to its public influence, perhaps also to its managerial character. Otherwise, this basic image of the economy, the competitive entrepreneurial firm, the supremacy of the market, and this nasty exception of monopoly, is not different in the modern textbook from that contained in Alfred Marshall's Principles of Economics, which was first published in the year 1890. I may say this was the textbook, massive thing, to which I was first exposed, and it was a very good textbook for weeding out students of insufficient diligence. But you will wonder, as you reflect on the extent of economic change in our time, if so static a view of basic economic arrangements can be valid. And you're right to wonder, for it's not valid. The image of economic structure that I've just described, and which, as I say, I venture to think will strike some familiar notes, survives because of its social and political and professional convenience, because it saves economists from inconvenient obsolescence in ideas and textbooks, and because it serves the social and political purposes, especially of modern corporate enterprise, or is deemed to do so. The service of this accepted or textbook economics, the image I've just offered, to the political needs of the business firm, and in particular to the large corporation, that service is, in fact, breathtaking. Very simply, it removes from the great corporation all power to do wrong and leaves with it only the power to do right. You could hardly ask for more than that. Are its prices too high? Well, the corporation is blameless. Prices the accepted economics holds are set impersonally by the market, not by the firm. Are profits too high? Well, they too are determined by prices and costs, which are externally determined, and thus by the market. Are products perhaps deficient in safety, durability, design, or need? Well, the consumer is sovereign. Products reflect the will of the sovereign consumer. You've heard that. If there's adverse effect on the environment, this reflects the higher preference of people for the goods being produced as opposed to the protection of air, water, landscape, or the tranquility of life. Is there criticism of the influence of corporations on the state? Say, of the unique foreign policy of the Lockheed Corporation in Italy or Japan or Holland? Well, these can only be aberrations, accidents, exceptions, because the corporation, like any citizen, is subordinate to the state, and it does not have public power of its own. You will see how great are the political and social advantages of an image of economic life which suppresses the power of the great corporation. It's not easy to think of the accepted economics as being the handmaiden of politics. Most economists suppress the thought, but it is, innocently or otherwise. However, self-delusion also has its cost. It conceals from us the way the economy really works and the things we need to do to make it work better. And people will not accept as valid an image of modern society that makes the modern great corporation, General Motors, IBM, Exxon, the helpless, passive instrument of market forces, which makes it a force of minimal and purely passive power in the state. This is simply too deeply at odds with common sense. So people come to believe that there must be something intrinsically deceptive about the modern great corporation, knowing that it's at odds with the case that is made for it or the case that explains it. And I would argue that it is now better and safer to have the truth. The valid image of the economic system is not of a single entrepreneurial system. It is, I suggest, of a double or bimodal system. The two parts, the two halves of this system, are very different in structure, but oddly enough, about equal in total production. In the United States, reflecting the force of the corporation for change in the last century, around 1,000 to 2,000. The second 1,000 isn't terribly important because it adds only marginally to the total. Contribute about half of all private economic product. And in some areas, the concentration is much greater. In 1967, 200 manufacturing corporations, out of a total of 200,000, shipped 42% of all manufactured goods by value, and later manufacturing figures suggest an even greater concentration. About 50 banks in 1971 had half of all assets. About 50 of the 1,800 life insurance companies had 80% of all assets. Concentration has also been, of course, very great in communications, the telephone company, television, very high in all forms of transportation except over-the-road transportation, and, of course, in power generation, and even in retailing. This is the half of the economy which, as I say, embraces perhaps 1,000 to 2,000 corporations. We can think of the small number when one reflects that one could get the heads of the companies that produce half of everything that is produced and used in the United States pretty well into this auditorium, although they would present on the whole, I think, a rather more prosperous appearance than you do. Set against this concentrated half of the economy is the dispersed sector. This in the United States, depending on whether we define lawyers, doctors, chiropractors, chiropodists, massage parlors, and other enterprises of that sort as firms or not, are somewhere between 10 and 12 million small firms. These, of course, include agriculture, also service and professional enterprises, also construction firms, also real estate firms, also a rapidly growing sector of the American economy, which unfortunately most of the economics profession is still unaware, artistic enterprises, small traders, small retailers. These contribute the other half. And the division in the other advanced industrial countries, Britain, Germany, Japan, differs only in degree. The valid image of the modern economic society, then, is of a more or less equal division of the production between a handful of large firms that are infinitely large and many small firms that are infinitely numerous, or almost so. And the coexistence of these two very different structures and the resulting economic behavior is a circumstance of the greatest importance. But first of all, before getting to that, I want to examine the corporate sector just a little bit more closely. The most obvious feature of the corporate half of the economy is the very great size of the participating units. In the United States, by now, a mere 3 or 4 great corporations, General Motors, Exxon, Ford, and at the very most a couple of others, have now sales equal to all of agriculture. And with this huge size in turn, we have the impact of the great corporation on the society. And this impact has two aspects, two features. There is first the great concentration of market and public power that the great firm deploys. And the second, a curiously opposing force, is the way in which this enterprise diffuses personal power. Makes it possible for people increasingly to exact their will in relation to aspects of its performance. I want to deal for a moment with each of these diverse tendencies as regards power. The modern large corporation, unlike the entrepreneurial firm of the textbooks, does have, because of its scale and its markets, extensive influence over its prices and over its costs. It also supplies itself with capital from its own earnings. It also strongly influences the tastes and behavior of its consumers. Even economists looking at television have some difficulty concealing from themselves the impact of modern advertising, although many still succeed. And the great firm lives in the closest relationship with modern government. The government, of course, gives it its legal existence. The government is also a very large buyer of its products, weapons and other things. The government supplies, in the manner of highways to the automobile industry, the services on which the sale of many of the products of the great firm depend. It also establishes the environmental and other parameters governing the production of its products and the character of its products. Also, an increasingly important function, the government is the safety net, the support price, into which the firm falls or onto which the firm falls in the event of difficulty. We might notice that above a certain size, as the experience of the Lockheed Corporation, which I mentioned a little while ago, numerous large American banks in the last couple of years, the Eastern Railroads, which we've just socialized in deep secrecy because nobody wanted to admit that this was done under a Republican administration. Numerous firms abroad, Chrysler in Britain, British Leyland, Krupp in Germany, numerous firms that make up the Erie complex in Italy. The modern large corporation is no longer allowed to go out of business. And modern socialism, which is expanding in all of the industrial countries, is principally expanding as the result of the adoption by governments, often reluctant governments, of these troubled or abandoned offspring of modern capitalism. Being so dependent in so many ways on the government, the corporation seeks power in the state. It probably has to survive. And in any case, the impulse to do so is normal. This power, like that, to fix prices, to fix costs, is not plenary. It's exercised within limits. But its existence can be denied only by people who are very carefully, very extensively trained in ignoring it. The corporation also distributes personal power within itself, the second half of this development on power. Once the owner or the capitalist, as I said, and this was true of the entrepreneurial firm, was the ultimate source of all authority. The modern corporation removes power from this ownership interest, from the stockholders, and also from the board of directors as the representative of the stockholder interest. No member of the board of directors of General Motors, Exxon, IBM, who is not a practical member of the management, and I speak very carefully here, has any influence on the operation of those companies. Most of these men who represent the stockholders, who represent the ownership interest, are aged, sometimes senile. They meet for a couple of hours on incredibly complex matters 6 times a year, most of them reflecting a desperate fear of being found out, and they do not make decisions. They ratify them. But as power passes from the owners and from the representatives of the owners to the management of the large firm, it is diffused. Decisions being numerous and complex, they must be delegated and redelegated. So power passes on to the enterprise. We know that nothing so criticizes an executive as to say that he cannot delegate authority. Also, decisions being socially and technically complex, they become the shared responsibility of specialists, each of whom possesses a certain slice of the requisite knowledge. They become the province of engineers, scientists, production men, marketing men, lawyers, accountants, tax specialists, and so on. Power, in other words, passes from individuals to groups, to what I've called the technostructure of the modern corporation. Professor Timmons mentioned the television enterprise with which I've been associated for the last several years. In the section on that in which we deal with the corporation, we show a picture, we resurrect a cartoon, which I've always liked very much. Another old friend of mine, Charles Adams, whose drawings I think some of you will readily enough identify from the New Yorker. Charlie, years ago, did a marvelous drawing of a man of rather opulent appearance, taking his son, a particularly cretinous youngster, the sort that Adams draws, on a walk down in front of the Sub-Treasury building, Wall Street, Broad Street, where there are a number of statues, including the statue of Alexander Hamilton. But on each of the statues, on each of the bases, there is no longer one man, but several. And the father is saying to the cretinous son, there are no longer great men, my boy, only great committees. It reflects a very important fact in the characteristic of the modern great enterprise. Finally, where there is no participation in decision, there is organization to influence it. And thus we have the trade union. The union is the natural answer to the powerless people to the power of the corporation. And only in the rarest cases in the industrial world is there a large corporation where labor is not so organized. I should say that this diffusion of power really extends beyond the boundaries of the corporation. For the corporation brings into existence a huge array of supporting professions and services, law firms to advise it on and sometimes to bend the law, accountants to record and sometimes to improve earnings, universities, colleges, and business schools to train its executives and specialists. This great institution, without question, came into existence very largely as the result of the supreme enlightenment of the people of Iowa, but it also came into existence at a time when large-scale enterprise increasingly needed the kind of skilled and trained manpower which it provides and which at least some of you hope you will be in a position to offer at an advantageous salary, and many other such supporting enterprises or individuals, dealers to sell its products, repairmen to advise that the products are beyond repair, so forth. Marx held that in the final stages of development, the capitalist firm devours the small entrepreneur. Well, there may be still some of that devouring going on, but it also nurtures and sustains a large penumbra of independent services. And these also have a certain voice, or anyway, they have to be considered in the operations of the corporation. They speak also for its interests. The test of our image of the economic system, to which I would like now, if I may, to turn, shouldn't lie, I suggest, in its political convenience. I don't think any of you will believe that. And it certainly should not if we're interested in analytically serviceable truths. The test should be whether our image accords with observed circumstance, whether it accords with observed need. The first test I want to apply to the revised image, which I have just offered, this bimodal image, concerns the first problem of our time, which is the first economic problem of our time, which is this grim tendency for severe unemployment in the modern industrial society to be combined with severe, persistent inflation. Does the new image explain this? We should notice that given the established image, competitive and entrepreneurial firms, this combination of unemployment and inflation cannot occur. There can be, in this image, inflation. But then, by restricting bank lending, which is monetary policy, and by tightening the public budget, which is fiscal policy, it's possible to contract the total demand for goods and services in the economy. And you will recall that no business firm controls prices, so production is affected only as prices fall. It is falling prices that bring to the firm the message of declining demand. So, in this image, as the very first effect, prices fall, level off or fall, which is to say that inflation has come to an end. This is a proposition which I think that you will all find possible to accept without undue reflection, that as prices level off and fall, you do not have inflation. It's, I think, a proposition on a par with one of the greatest observations of past presidents, which is actually in his memoirs. I found it there once. Calvin Coolidge's great statement that when many people are out of work, unemployment results. After prices have fallen, which is, say, after the inflation is over, in this image, production falling, there may be unemployment. Probably will be. But unemployment and inflation do not and cannot coexist, because the unemployment comes because the prices have fallen. Similarly, if there is unemployment, aggregate demand in the economy can be expanded by monetary and fiscal action, by easier bank lending, more public expenditures, lower taxes, the tax rebate, which I think quite wisely President Carter decided to abort. The initial effect is more sales, more jobs. As workers in plants are fully occupied, since this is a competitive economy, competition will at some stage drive up wages and prices. But this happens because people are relatively fully employed and because the economy is running at or near capacity. Again, although one doesn't want to be completely dogmatic about this, one does not have very much unemployment until one does not have very much inflation until the unemployed have been brought back into jobs. Again, one has unemployment or inflation, but not both. In the bimodal image of the economy, a combination of inflation and unemployment must be expected, at least for so long as fiscal and monetary policy are the sole instruments of economic management. Trade unions, as we have seen, do have power in the corporate sector of the economy, this diffusion process which I talked about. The corporation, having power in its market, has the power to offset trade union concessions in wages with higher prices. We have, I think, all noticed that modern collective bargaining has lost much of its old-fashioned anger, and this has been for a very simple reason. As an alternative to confrontation, unions and management can now reach agreement, pass the resulting costs on to the public. Oh, there's still some ceremonial exchange of insults to remind us that the class struggle is not dead, but these are primarily to serve the nostalgic tendencies of our time. The principal tendency of modern collective bargaining, as the Ford Motor Company said a few months ago, is to find out what the union wants. The complaint now comes almost exclusively from the public over the higher price that it has to pay, or from the government over the inflationary effect of the wage settlement. When this wage price inflation is attacked by the traditional methods, monetary and budget restraint to reduce demand, prices do not automatically fall. The firm has the power to maintain its prices, and the first effect is on sales and employment. And if unions continue to press for higher wages, the large corporation can continue to increase its prices, and it does. Only when unemployment is very severe, so severe as to deter the unions in pressing for wage increases and the corporations from exercising their power to raise prices, do the traditional monetary and fiscal measures, does the traditional macroeconomics begin to bite. Meanwhile, unemployment and inflation, as in fact in the world today, do coexist. We suffer from both. Before monetary and fiscal policy act on the corporate sector, here I come to a point of no small local importance, they do work on the competitive and entrepreneurial sector of the economy. Here, as before, prices do respond to monetary and fiscal policies to restrain demand. So while inflation continues in the corporate half of the economy, there can be falling farm prices and a painful recession in the entrepreneurial and competitive sector. And this, too, accords fully with recent circumstance. Farm prices, as everyone here knows, or should, fell sharply in the recent recession. Industrial prices, by contrast, never stopped rising. Other entrepreneurial industries, like agriculture, housing being a very prominent example, also had a very sharp recession. Housing output fell by around a third, more seriously than at any time since the Great Depression. As I say, at the same time, prices in the industrial sector continue to rise. All fits, and all fits, I would urge, John, with particular relevance for my fellow agricultural economists. The practical conclusion is, I think, that inflation cannot now be arrested by fiscal and monetary policy in the corporate sector of my bimodal model unless there is willingness to accept a very large amount of unemployment. This means that there's only one alternative, and that is to restrain incomes and prices, not by unemployment, but by some form of direct intervention, by some form of incomes and price policy. Such action, which I can't emphasize too strongly, is only in this sector where power is diffused and wages act on prices and prices act on wages. Such action is not a substitute for orthodox monetary and fiscal management, but an essential supplement to it. There's a further test here of the validity of the image that I'm speaking of, for this is the direction in which I believe most industrial countries are moving, and against the advice of all the more reputable voices of conventional economics. In Germany, Austria, Switzerland, Scandinavia, wage negotiation has been for many years not industry-wide, but confederation-wide, takes in the whole of the confederation of labor in those countries, and has been in accordance with an implicit system of wage restraints which calculates the effect of the wage increase on prices and on including export prices. And in Austria and Germany, this is supplemented by a strict compact that this restraint will not be negated by the corporations taking advantage of it by higher prices. This is the system which generally rules on the continent, even in such countries as which are so often pictured as paragons of free enterprise as Germany and Switzerland. Britain has now, of course, a formal and comprehensive system of income and price control. So also has Canada. France, in the Plan Barre, has recently moved in this same direction. And I would urge that no one risk his money or his reputation for prophecy on the proposition that the United States will not follow. If, as the new administration promises, unemployment is to be effectively reduced, there will have to be some form of control. Otherwise, as we move closer to full employment, there will be much too serious inflation. I venture to think that most of the effort will go into finding some other name for control. This is a point on which we see the intrinsically unhappy existence of the economist and why the profession breeds such intrinsically gloomy character. One can have inflation. Well, there are four possibilities in life, really. One can have inflation, which is possible. It's a very unpleasant thing for people who have made a contract with society that their savings will take care of them in their old age, who have fixed incomes, pensions, whose incomes do not rise readily with prices, and who suffer the pain of wondering what their money will buy every time they go to the supermarket. We can have enough unemployment to arrest that inflation. I think it's very difficult to find anyone in the Republic who will vocally come out in favor of unemployment, although there are some. Or we can have some system in the organized sector of the bimodal economy, where the wage spiral works, to some system of direct intervention to control the spiral. Those are the three possibilities. The fourth possibility, as I've often said, is to believe that God is a Democrat and a member of the Brookings Institution. The bimodal view of the industrial economy also explains some other interesting phenomena of our time, including the unequal development of the economy and the measures that all governments of all political complexion find themselves taking to deal with this unequal development. The corporate half of the economy does most things rather well. This is because it combines advanced organization with high technical skills, with relatively ample capital from its own resources, with ability to persuade the consumer and the state as to their need for its products. In consequence, in all of the industrial countries, we take for granted that automobiles, weapons, household appliances, pharmaceuticals, alcohol, tobacco, cosmetics, chemicals, all of the things that come from the highly organized sector of the economy will be amply supplied. The very notion of shortage, inadequacy in these products would strike us as distinctly odd. Our brief experience 3 years ago with the oil embargo was deeply traumatic and something which is still deeply affecting public policy. Perhaps, I think, wisely, because I think there is I must say, I think that the statements that the moves that the President made on the energy program are well considered, wise, perhaps with some exaggeration as to the extent of sacrifice that is involved. We must, I think, all remember that as a nation we deeply love sacrifice as long as it involves no pain. But in the competitive and entrepreneurial sector of the economy, organization is much less advanced. Technology on the whole is much less advanced. Agriculture is something of an exception, but the technology that agriculture uses came very largely from the state, public institutions such as this, as well as from the large industries that serve agriculture. Capital is not so easy to come by, and persuasion is absent. And in these industries, quite commonly, we assume inadequacy. Housing is something which is inadequate in all industrial countries for people of middle income on down, as supplied by the market system. Health care, likewise, point that I needn't develop. We have numerous recurrent complaints about wide ranges of consumer services. They're part of our folk rights. And in recent times, and increasingly, food supply has been a deep source of anxiety. The conventional economics has only one explanation for this unequal development. It reflects consumer choice. It reflects the will of the sovereign consumer, which is to say that the consumer, or large numbers of consumers, are unaware of their needs for health care, for housing, for consumer services, or for food, which is to say that the conventional economics explains this unequal development by saying that the consumer is insane. This is really hard to believe and not very flattering. The bimodal image of the economy also serves our understanding of inequality in the modern economy and its consequences. In the conventional image of the economy, inequality exists, but it is the result of differences only of talent, luck, or choice of ancestors. But between occupations, it is constantly being remedied by movement from lower to higher income occupations. I don't think anyone can have any doubt that this remedy does operate. But it will only work if people are able easily to move. The corporate sector of the economy again deserves considerable approval, more than it receives, for the income that it provides. I don't think in the United States that there's any union member with full-time employment in the corporate half of the economy whose income now falls appreciably below the poverty line. But there are grave barriers to movement into this sector. In particular, so long as inflation is the chief problem and monetary and fiscal policy are the remedies, there will be unemployment in this sector, as we have seen, either chronic or recurrent. And if there is unemployment, there obviously can't be easy movement of new workers into this sector. The old unemployed will always have the first chance. In the entrepreneurial or small-scale sector, by contrast, employment can often be found or maintained either by taking a lower self-employment return, this is the normal situation in agriculture, or possibly low pay in an industry that has no union. There is, in other words, a continuing source of inequality here between the two sectors based on the occluded movement between them. This, if I might digress for a moment, is not a total explanation of the problem of inequality, and it's, I must say, a problem that I think should be increasingly on our minds, because in contrast with the hopes that many of my generation had in the years of World War II and after, when it seemed that inequality was decreasing, it is in fact, and has been in recent years, increasing. That inequality was decreasing. It has in recent years been in fact increasing, and increasing rather with a rather distressing rapidity. The share going to the upper 5% of income recipients has been increasing very rapidly. The share going to the upper 20% also, and the share going for the same pro tanto for the people in the lower half of the income recipients has been, for the same reasons, diminishing. As a matter of fact, this, the increase after 1970 in the share going to the very top income brackets, the upper 5% and the upper 20%, was so spectacular that even the Nixon administration had to take action. They stopped publishing those figures. But they did, and they wouldn't be published today if Congressman Henry Royce of Wisconsin hadn't noticed it and forced them out. There are further tests of the image that I'm here offering. I'd like to conclude by combining several into one. In removing power from owners, diffusing it through the technostructure, accepting and even nurturing the organized response of workers, the modern corporation does more than diffuse power. It is part of a long step, not toward a class society, at least toward one in which the class lines of consumption are extensively blurred. This point, which I mentioned at the outset, has a strong influence in turn on consumption patterns. There's no longer, in the corporate sector of the economy, any large group of people who feel that they were meant by the nature of their occupation to consume at some minimum level. The pressure, in turn, that they exert, both for private goods and services and the requisite wages to supply those private goods and services, is one source of inflation, the wage price spiral. Pressure also for such public services as education, health care, housing, the state provides in very large amounts. Urban services is another source. And the thrust both for more private income and consumption, more public goods and services, which we see as the same ultimate source, is equally strong. And we see now that it is associated with the power diffused by the corporation to make the claim effective. Accordingly, to cut consumption of private goods through taxes or public goods through reduced public outlays, both of the old classic remedies for inflation, is very difficult. So also is the resistance, of course, to direct intervention on wages and prices, on the wage half of that intervention. So the bimodal image of economic society, tells us of new budget pressures with inflationary effect, new budget pressures both private and public, as well as the new sources of inflation in the wage price spiral. And it tells us a good deal as to why control has become so difficult. Finally, the image of the economy here offered explains the new tensions in the relationship between economic institutions and the state. The competitive and entrepreneurial firm seeks services from the state. There's no question about that. It seeks the many services that are supplied, for example, to agriculture. It seeks protection from foreign competition. It's subject to regulation and seeks favorable action from the state on that, subject to taxes, and is concerned with its own interest on that. But all of this is a familiar and also a limited relationship. The entrepreneurial firm, by itself or through its organization, never competes with the state in the exercise of power, and it never overrides the state in its exercise of power. The modern large corporation, in contrast, with its wide range of requirements from the state, a much wider range of requirements, I think, on balance than the entrepreneurial sector, although much less publicized, brings its power directly to bear on the instrumentalities of the state, on both the bureaucracy and the legislature. The individual farmer, or even the individual leader of a farm organization, does not have automatic access to his legislator or to the executive, or if he does, it is a relatively limited one. Head of General Motors, General Electric, General Mills, General Dynamics, any of the other generals, has automatic access to the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of State, or whoever. This as well as to the legislature. Also, the needs of the great corporation from the state, since they are put forward by the technostructure, by the management, are put forward by the most influential and articulate sector of the population, and they have a way, because they come from the influential and reputable and articulate sector of the population, of becoming the reputable public policy. No newspaper ever gets criticized for an editorial which supports General Electric on something that it is seeking in the way of tax reform. We've also had had a considerable education recent times in the way financial resources are can be deployed for the purchase of politicians and political influence. And the corporation also competes with the state in the exercise of power of a purely public sort. I mentioned Lockheed once before. In recent years, the foreign policy of the Northrop Corporation and the Lockheed Corporation have had at least as much influence in destabilizing foreign politicians, been at least as effective as the similar operations of the CIA. I had occasion a few weeks ago to give a lecture to the mass staff of the intelligence agencies in Washington, and I made this point, that I thought on the whole Lockheed had been more effective in